Gauge schmage. Is it important? What is it? Let's talk about it. Hi, it's Sonia here, the Pretty Stitch, with today's episode of Yarn Matters. So let's talk gauge. I'm sure if you have started to knit or crochet and you have gotten a pattern or read a pattern and you've seen gauge and you might be wondering, what is it? Should I care? Is it important? And the answers to those questions are yes and no. So in some instances, and this applies to crochet or knitting or Tunisian crochet, gauge is very important. In other instances, gauge is not so important. It really just depends on what you're making. So let's talk about gauge as what is it actually? What is gauge? Because I know when I first started to crochet, I would see it in a pattern. I'd be like, what does this mean? I don't know what this means. This makes no sense to me. So some of you might be feeling the same way. So gauge is actually, if you have a pattern, usually you'll see something like 5 stitches and 6 rows equals either 2 inches or 3 inches, or sometimes it's an inch or 4 inches. So I have some swatches that I will show you to give you a better understanding about gauge, because I feel like with gauge it's easier to show someone what it is than to really explain it, if that makes sense. So here are my 2 swatches, and please excuse them. I made them with scrap yarn. So here is swatch number 1, and I'm not sure what was going on down there with my knitting here. So these are knitted swatches. So this swatch was made with size 8 needles, worsted weight yarn or number 4 yarn, and I made 20 stitches across. So 20 stitches across, and I worked 21 rows. So we have 20 stitches across, 21 rows that I worked for this swatch using size 8 needles. So here is another swatch. This was the same yarn. Again, the swatch isn't super pretty, but I used size 3 needles. I used worsted weight yarn, exactly the same yarn as this guy here. And I made the same thing. So I did 20 stitches across, 21 rows. So you can clearly see the difference in size, especially if I hold it up like that. Even though we did the same amount of stitches, the same amount of rows, same yarn as this guy, the only difference is we use different needles. So again, size 3 needles, size 8 needles. So this one is clearly larger than this one. So my gauge, so if this is a gauge swatch, so this is, I did it 4 by 4. So this is 4 inches across and 4 inches tall. And so if this was a pattern and someone, let's say they wanted to make a sweater, if it would, let's say it was a sweater pattern, and the gauge said 20 stitches by 21 rows, so equals 4 inches. So what you would need to do using size 8 needles and number 4 yarn, so you would, to try to match this gauge, you would get the same yarn, use the same needles, cast on your 20 stitches, work your 21 rows, and see if you match that 4 inches. And then if you do, then you go ahead and make the pattern, because as I said, gauge is important for some things. Some things it's really not as important. So let's say you wanted to make a particular size of the sweater, and this was the gauge swatch, and you matched the designer's gauge, then if you decided to make that particular size, you should be good to go. But let's say you decided to just wanted to make that sweater pattern, you just jump in and you're like, okay, I have number 4 yarn, I only have number 3 needles, I'm just going to make it anyway. Well, clearly this is a lot smaller, so what's going to happen is your sweater will end up a bit smaller than this guy. So that's why sometimes gauge is important, and that also applies with crocheting. So I have 2 examples of the same exact pattern which demonstrates gauge in a way. So I have this hat, please excuse the ends, I didn't weave them in yet. So I have this hat, and if you're interested in making this hat, I have the pattern, I can link it for you. And here is the same exact hat. So as you can clearly see, this gray, dark gray hat is a little bit bigger than this. This is actually a light gray. I'm not sure if it's showing up well. So for this guy, I use a size I or 5.5 millimeter hook to make this hat. And for this one, I used a J hook, which is a 6 millimeter hook. And so this, and it's the exact same yarn. It's just different color, but it's the same brand, same yarns, Paint Box Yarns, Aran Weight, I think it's called. And this guy, again, Paint Box Yarn, Aran Weight. So exact same yarn, just a different color, and obviously, you know, this hat is just a little bit wider. Like you can't even, when I hold them together, you can't even see the light gray one behind this guy. So this clearly is a larger hat. So if someone has a small head, this would work out fine, but let's say you wanted to, you know, make this hat and gift it to, you know, maybe a man with a large head. This might not work because you didn't, you know, match the gauge. So you can play around with gauge, especially if you're more experienced, and so you know, like for myself, I've been knitting and crocheting for quite a long time, so I know what types of yarns there are. I know, like, if I use a certain type of yarn and a certain type of needle, a size needle, like it's going to result in a certain type of fabric. So that's how gauge can be important. So you also might think, as going on with gauge being important, so you might be like, okay, I have size 8 needles and the pattern calls for size 8 needles. Pattern calls for worsted weight yarn or number 4 yarn, but I don't have that. I have decate weight yarn, which is a little bit of a thinner yarn than worsted weight yarn. So let's continue with that example of the size 8 needles. So here we go, size 8 needles. And you are saying the pattern calls for worsted weight, but you only have decate weight yarn. So here is a worsted weight yarn. Hopefully it's, let's see if I can do the hand thing as they always do, you know, it's showing up. That's worsted weight yarn. So here we go. I have a sample of decate weight yarn. So let's say you only have decate weight yarn. So it's not a lot thinner than a worsted weight, but it is a little bit thinner. So even if you're using size 8 needles, your project's going to result in a smaller size. And that might be okay because you might be like, oh, I really want to make this, but you know, that's going to be a little big for me. So you can play around with the gauge a little bit by using, you know, smaller needles or larger needles. And if you want to see a reference of those swatches as far as the needles, so I had used, these are the exact needles that I used to make those swatches. So these are size 8, these are size 3. So you can clearly see the difference in sizes as these needles are thicker than these guys. And those same principles apply to crochet because you have different size hooks. You have thicker hooks, thinner hooks, and depending on what size hook you use, you know, the example of these hats, you know, this was an I hook, this was a J hook, same exact yarn, same exact pattern, results in a smaller hat. And so that's why gauge can be important. Now, some people, they get like completely insane over gauge, like it's not that serious, really. It's not. It's not that deep, it's not that serious. So if you want to make a particular pattern and you're working on your gauge swatch, so a swatch would be that, so a swatch is just a little practice guy, like here, this is just a little practice guy. So you're working on your little practice guy, you know, you're working, you know, because you just want to see how the particular yarn that you picked will stitch up, and you're like measuring your gauge. So let's measure it right now. So here's my little tape measure to demonstrate. So I'm in the US, so we have inches, but the same thing would apply for centimeters. So if you're measuring this guy across, you've made your swatch. So you can see it's about 4 inches across and 4 inches in length. So you're working on your swatch and yours is not exactly 4 inches. It might be, let's say it's 4.5. Let's say it might be 4.5 in length and maybe it's 4 inches across. That should be okay. it's going to be just a slight difference. So when I write patterns, when I write the gauge, I usually just say about, because so some people crochet more tightly, some people crochet more loosely. Same thing applies to knitting. Some people stitch very, very tightly, some people stitch more loosely. And that's not right or wrong, it's just how you stitch, it's okay. And that will also affect your gauge. Even if you are using the same yarn and the same hooks or the same needles, your gauge might not be exactly like the designer. Another thing that can affect your gauge is if the project needs to be blocked. So if you're using a yarn, so this yarn here for these practice swatches were just made with acrylic yarn. So if I blocked this, it really wouldn't get much larger. So blocking, and that I should probably do another episode about blocking, is basically just kind of stretching out your project, finishing it off. But some yarns will actually grow a little bit after they've been blocked, and that will affect your gauge. So you might do a practice swatch especially in a natural fiber, let's say wool, and you didn't block it, and you're like, oh, that matches my gauge perfectly. So you go ahead, you make your project, and then you're like, oh, this needs to be blocked. So you gently block it, stretch it out a little bit. All of a sudden, it's a little bit bigger. So that can factor in your gauge as well. And I know this is a lot of information. It's probably a little confusing. So if you're just starting out, try to just chill out about gauge a little bit. Don't get so bent out of shape. We learn by doing. So if the more you crochet, the more you knit, the more you're going to understand the craft, your project, your stitches, all that kind of thing. And the gauge thing will start to click a little bit. So I wouldn't really stress that much about it if you can't get your gauge exactly. Or if you make a project and it's slightly big. I mean, baby stuff is great, because I tell people not to stress too much about especially when you're making a baby item, because babies grow. So if you made this baby sweater and it's supposed to be newborn, and you're just like, oh, she's a little bit larger, maybe 6-month-old, that's fine. Baby's gonna grow. It'll be fine. They'll fit into it eventually. Now, if you're making it for an adult, that might be a problem, especially if you're making a more fitted sweater. But let's say you're making like a boxy cardigan. If it's a little bit bigger, most likely it's gonna be fine. Now, I would, learn about your yarn a little bit that you're using. So as I said, some natural fibers, the yarn grows. So if you really don't want your project to grow a whole lot, don't pick a yarn that's going to really grow a lot. If you prefer to only work with natural fibers, that's okay. Just maybe pick a yarn that is maybe a natural fiber acrylic blend, and then it won't grow as much. Now, as I said, sometimes gauge really doesn't matter. It depends on the project that you're making. So for instance, here is a scarf and this is one of my patterns. So if you are interested in this is a fun, it's got built-in fringe, it's crocheted right on. This is crocheted. So this pattern, gauge does not matter for this guy, because with this pattern, I designed it where you can use any yarn, any hook, and obviously the gauge is going to vary. You can also make this scarf as long as you would like, as wide. So let's see, I don't have enough hands. So the width here, you can make this wider. So if you're making this scarf wider, obviously that will affect your gauge. If you're using, I made this guy a while ago, about a year ago. So this one, I believe it's probably made with either an H hook, and the yarn is DK weight yarn. I know that for a fact. So let's say you wanted to make your scarf in an I hook and number 5 yarn, which is a chunkier yarn, or a J hook. Obviously, your gauge is going to be different than this, but it really doesn't matter, because you're making it to suit your taste, and the finished product is going to look similar. It's not going to look exactly the same, but it's going to look similar, and it's still going to be pretty cute. So in this case, gauge doesn't really matter. And a lot of times when you're making scarves, things like that, if your gauge doesn't, let's say they have a pattern and it's exact stitches, you have to chain an exact amount and all that stuff, and your gauge is slightly off, it's okay. It's a scarf, it's not a wearable that it's crucial that, the gauge kind of has to be close, Same thing applies with blankets. Blankets again. Now, some people, they're very super anal and they must have it exactly the picture, then, gauge is important to them. But as I say with the blanket, it's blanket. It's okay. Unless you need to make like a king size blanket, then yeah, you might not want to, if the pattern's calling for an eye hook and, worsted weight yarn and it's a king size blanket for a king size bed, you don't want to be like, oh, well, I only have a 2.75 millimeter hook, which is really small, and number like fingering weight yarn, which again is very thin yarn. You're going to have a much smaller blanket than a king size blanket. So, then it might matter if you wanted to make a particular size. But if you just were like, oh, I love this king size pattern, I only have a size 2.75 millimeter hook, and I only have fingering weight yarn, I don't care what size it is, go ahead and make it. It's going to be fine, And those same rules apply with knitted items as well. If you're making, a knitted scarf, a dishcloth. A dishcloth can be in various sizes. You might want to have a traditional size dishcloth, but if it ends up a little bit smaller, I like smaller things. I have small hands, so a lot of times for me, I don't want a huge dishcloth. So make it work. It's okay. To just recap on this whole gauge thing, it's important to a point, but don't stress out too much about it. If you are making sweaters, usually wearable items, gauge is definitely more important. But if you cannot get it exactly like the designer, it's okay. Chances are your sweater's going to fit fine. Your top, your skirt, whatever you're making. Another way to match your gauge more. So let's say the pattern that you chose to make a sweater, and you made a swatch to see if your gauge matches what the designer has in the directions, and you just can't quite get it. Just change your needle size or your hook size and you might be able to match their gauge, because they might be more a tighter knitter or a looser knitter. I find this a lot because I tend to be I crochet more tightly, and I knit more tightly too. It's just, I guess I'm wound too tight. I don't know. So I do find that a lot with certain patterns, that I'll make something and it's, maybe a little bit smaller than the designers, and it's just because I crochet more tightly. So maybe I need to bump up a needle size, bump up a hook size. And I often say that because I write a lot of my own patterns, and I will say that often in my pattern directions, that it's okay if you need to bump up a size in whether it's a knitted or a crochet pattern. There's really no, as I say, there's no knitting police, there's no crochet police. So if you need to just kind of change things a little bit to make it work for you, it's fine. It's okay. Don't get so rigid with your stitching, because it kind of takes the fun out of it, and just relax a little bit. So relax a little bit with gauge, and you might make that sweater that's huge. I've done it. It's kind of funny. You learn from it, you grow from it, and you can do what I do, is I call it recycling, and just take it apart and try it again, which, sometimes that's annoying because you don't want to take apart all that work, but that's how you learn, and that's how you get better. So I hope this helped out with learning about gauge and the importance, not importance of gauge. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like and subscribe. And if you didn't like this video, then just scroll on by. It's fine. And I thank you so much for watching.